The air was thick with heat as Luke Dust Donovan pushed through the thick swampland of Florida. He was a cowboy, a man who had spent most of his life traveling the open plains and dusty roads. But this place, this swamp, was different. The trees were tall and twisted, draped in thick layers of moss, the ground soft and treacherous underfoot. It wasn't the kind of land a cowboy like Dust was used to, but it was where his feet had taken him. His horse, a tired-looking mare, struggled to keep up with him as he trudged through the swamp, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. He didn't mind the mud. It was the weight on his shoulders that was the real burden. He had lost everything in a land dispute with a powerful cattle baron, and now he was alone with nothing but his past and the dusty road ahead of him. Dust hadn't planned to stay long in Florida. He was just passing through looking for work, but when you were a man like him, grizzled, tough, and a bit of a loner, work didn't come easy. And here, in the heart of Florida, the only thing that came in abundance were problems. As the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, Dust's weary eyes caught a strange sight in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, maybe some movement in the dense underbrush. But no, it was real. There, tied to a tree, was a woman. Dust's hand instinctively went to the grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw it. He had seen enough violence in his life to know when something didn't feel right. He approached cautiously, the crunch of leaves underfoot seeming too loud in the eerie silence of the swamp. The woman was slumped against the tree, her hands bound tightly with rough, thick rope. Her clothes were torn and her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. She looked wild, and yet there was a calmness in her eyes that met Dust's with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Dust stopped a few paces away, his eyes scanning the area for any threats. The swamp was quiet, but he knew better than to assume he was alone. Whoever had left her here might still be close by, watching from the shadows, but the woman didn't seem concerned about that. She just stared at him, her lips cracked and dry. "You're not going to shoot me, are you?" she asked in a hoarse voice. Dust hesitated. The woman's words were sharp, like she wasn't afraid of anything. Not even the gun that was still holstered at his side. Something about her made him pause. She was no ordinary captive. He took a step forward, his hand still on the gun, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he reached for the knife on his belt. "I'm not here to harm you," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Just trying to figure out who did this to you." The woman gave a small, bitter laugh, her eyes rolling slightly as she spoke again, this time with more force. "The whites did this. They call it justice." She spat the words like they were poison on her tongue. Dust frowned at her words. He had heard of the tensions in the area between settlers and the Seminole people, but he wasn't prepared for this. The way she spoke made it clear that she wasn't some innocent bystander, caught in the middle of something bigger. She was part of it, part of a long history of struggles between the native people and the encroaching settlers who wanted the land. "What's your name?" Dust asked, cutting through the ropes that held her to the tree. He wasn't sure why he bothered. Maybe it was the anger in her voice, or maybe it was the way she looked at him like he was the last hope in a world that had forgotten about her. "Ayanna," she said simply, rubbing her wrists where the rope had cut into her skin. Dust offered her the canteen from his saddlebag, and she took it gratefully, drinking deeply as if it had been days since she had last had water. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the swamp, and Dust could feel the weight of the silence between them. "Why were you tied up like that?" Dust asked, his voice softening. He didn't need to ask. He knew the answer. But the words hung in the air between them like an invitation for her to tell her story. Ayanna took a deep breath before speaking, her voice low. "I'm Seminole Outcast. They didn't want me. My people. They're trying to survive, but not like this, not by bending to the settlers." She paused, looking out at the swamp, her gaze distant. "I refused to let them take my land. I fought. I fought for my people, for our way of life, but it wasn't enough. I was cast out, left to die in the swamps." Her eyes met his again, dark and steady. "The settlers. They don't care about that. They just want us gone." Dust listened, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had seen what the settlers were doing to the native tribes. The constant pressure, the broken promises, the land stolen away piece by piece. It wasn't right, but it wasn't the first time he had seen such cruelty. Still, something in Ayanna's story struck him. She was strong, defiant. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. He couldn't just walk away from this, not when he had already been pulled into it. He had a reputation for staying out of other people's problems, but this was different. This wasn't just some dispute over land. This was a fight for survival, for something far bigger than any one person. "We need to get you out of here," Dust said, his voice firm. "There's a cabin not far from here. You can rest there for the night. It's not safe to stay here." Ayanna nodded, though she didn't speak. She looked tired, but the fire in her eyes hadn't gone out. She stood slowly, wobbling a bit as she tested her legs, clearly weak from days of captivity and hunger. Dust offered her his arm to steady her, and she took it without hesitation, though she didn't seem to need much help. Together, they moved through the swamp, Dust leading the way, his eyes always scanning the shadows. They walked in silence, the only sound the rustle of the leaves and the occasional call of a bird. As the darkness fell, Dust couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had seen too many ambushes in his time to ignore the gut instinct telling him they were not alone. But for now, they were safe, at least for the moment. When they finally reached the cabin, Dust helped Ayanna inside. It was small, built long ago by some hunter or trapper, and hadn't seen much use in years. The roof had a hole in it and the windows were boarded up, but it was shelter. They could rest here for the night. Dust sat near the door, keeping watch. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But one thing was certain: Ayanna's story wasn't over, and neither was his. This version of Part 1 builds on the characters and sets up the conflict, while keeping things simple and engaging for the audience. The pacing is steady, and the focus is on the development of the relationship between Dust and Ayanna, as well as the mystery of what lies ahead. The air was thick with the sounds of the swamp as Dust and Ayanna sat in the small cabin. Night had fully fallen, and the only light in the room came from a small fire burning in the hearth. Dust had built it carefully, knowing how important it was to stay warm, but also how dangerous it was to attract attention. He sat near the door, his eyes always scanning the shadows outside. Ayanna had curled up in the far corner, her back against the cabin's wall, trying to rest after the long journey. She had been through so much already, but her eyes still burned with an intensity that couldn't be extinguished. It was clear to Dust that her spirit wasn't easily broken. For a while there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the trees outside. Dust's thoughts wandered to his own life, the road that had led him here and the reasons he kept moving forward. But when he glanced over at Ayanna, he remembered the weight of her struggle and the battle that was far from over. Suddenly, the sound of hooves crunching on dry ground reached his ears, sharp and clear in the quiet night. Dust stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. He had learned long ago not to trust the night, especially not in places like this. He looked over at Ayanna, who had tensed at the noise, her hand reaching for the knife she had hidden beneath her torn coat. "Stay here," Dust whispered, standing up slowly, his boots making almost no sound as he moved toward the door. He crouched low, peering through the gap between the boards nailed to the cabin window. Outside, he could just make out the faint shapes of men on horseback, moving slowly through the trees. Dust's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the figures. Bounty hunters. The same men he had seen in the nearby town a few days before. The ones who had been asking around about the Seminoles, trying to track them down for the settlers. Dust cursed under his breath. They must have found her trail. He moved back to Ayanna, who was already on her feet, her face set in determination. There was no fear in her eyes, just a calm readiness. She didn't need to be told what was coming. She had lived this life for too long to expect anything else. "We've got to move," Dust said, his voice low. "They're close. We can't stay here." Ayanna nodded, grabbing her knife and a small bundle of supplies from the corner. The two of them moved quickly, silently, out the back of the cabin and into the dense trees. The swamp was thick with shadows and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. Dust could hear the bounty hunters' voices growing louder as they searched for signs of life, but he didn't dare look back. He knew they had to get out of there. The land was familiar to Ayanna, and she led the way through the dense underbrush, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the swamp like the back of her hand. Dust followed, pushing through the thick foliage as quietly as he could. His mind raced, thinking of all the possible paths they could take, all the places to hide. After a few miles of fast walking, they came upon a small stream. The water was shallow but fast-moving, and it would hide their tracks. Ayana knelt beside it, cupping her hands to drink while Dust stood guard, his senses on high alert. The sounds of the hunters had faded slightly, but Dust knew they wouldn't be far behind. He couldn't afford to relax yet. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly after a moment. Ayana nodded and stood, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "They'll keep searching the woods for hours, but it won't take them long to realize we've crossed the stream. We'll need to be gone by dawn." Dust didn't argue. He knew she was right. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop until they found her, or worse, until they brought her back to the settlers. But Dust also knew that he couldn't just let them do that. The next few hours were spent moving in and out of the dense forest. They kept their pace steady, knowing that the further they got from the cabin, the better chance they had of escaping the bounty hunters. Ayana guided them through narrow, hidden trails, and Dust kept his eyes sharp for any signs of danger. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the trees made his heart race. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore, he was protecting her too. As the night dragged on, they finally came to a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting long shadows on the ground. Ayana stopped, turning to Dust with a serious look on her face. "We need to talk," she said. Dust raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Instead, he gave her a slight nod, signaling for her to continue. Ayana took a deep breath before speaking again. "The settlers don't just want to hunt me down. They're hunting all of my people. The Seminoles. They've already destroyed my village. They've taken everything from us. They've pushed us farther and farther into the swamp, hoping we'll just disappear." Dust didn't interrupt, though the weight of her words pressed down on him. The more he heard, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one woman's survival. This was about something much bigger, something much more dangerous. "They don't understand us," Ayana continued, her voice quiet but firm. "They don't understand that we are not just animals to be hunted. We are a people with our own way of life, our own beliefs, and we're not going to disappear quietly." Dust met her eyes, and for the first time he saw the true fire in her gaze. It wasn't just anger, it was resolve. She wasn't just running from the bounty hunters. She was fighting for something much bigger than herself. And somewhere deep inside, Dust realized that he too had been fighting for something his whole life, though he hadn't known what it was until now. "You're right," Dust said quietly. "But you're not alone in this fight." Ayana's expression softened slightly. She had expected him to turn away, to keep walking, but Dust had made a decision. He wasn't just going to leave her to fight this battle alone. There was a part of him that had always wanted to stand for something, and now he had found it. He had found a cause worth fighting for. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Dust and Ayana stood together in the clearing. The world around them was quiet, but they both knew the peace would not last long. The bounty hunters were still out there, and they wouldn't give up until they had captured Ayana. But Dust didn't feel afraid anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, and the fight would be tough, but for the first time in a long while he knew where he stood. And with Ayana by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next.